Shopify grows your business no matter how far or big you grow. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. Whether you're selling your fans' next favorite shirt or an exclusive piece of podcast merch, Shopify helps you sell everywhere. Shopify powers 10% of all e-commerce in the US. Allbirds, Rothy's, Brooklinen, and millions of other entrepreneurs of every size across 175 countries. Plus, Shopify's award-winning help is there to support your success every step of the way. Because businesses that grow, grow with Shopify. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income now to grow your business, no matter what stage you're in.
This is the story of the one. As a maintenance engineer, he hears things differently. To the untrained ear, everything on his shop floor might sound fine, but he can hear gears grinding or a belt slipping. So he steps in to fix the problem at hand before it gets out of hand. And he knows Granger's got the right product he needs to get the job done, which is music to his ears. Call, click Granger.com, or just stop by. Granger, for the ones who get it done.
This content may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion advised.
The stories I've told today are less than 10% of what I experienced as an undertaker. Needless to say, this job was harrowing. Many of my assignments were so disturbing that I've buried them deep in my subconscious.
We don't know if this guy was trying to break in or if maybe he thought it was his buddy's house. I guess I'll never know, but I still get goosebumps listening to that recording.
From Killer Podcasts. True tales of horror, bizarre happenings, unexplainable events. This is Disturbed. Hello, and welcome back to the show. This week, we're bringing you 3 stories that will push you to the brink. So sit back, listen closely, and dive into the horror. First, a story narrated by Katarina Sveta from Reddit user Raging See You Next Tuesday. A man was caught on my sleep recording app. Told by our own Elizabeth Flood.
This happened about 7 years ago, but thinking about it still keeps me awake at night sometimes. I was at a sleepover with my friends, Sophia and Hannah. It was just us 3 girls. No parents or siblings home that night, but we were in a safe area, so we weren't nervous at all. It was summer, so we slept with the window wide open, letting the cool breeze waft in. There wasn't a screen on the window, but we didn't think anything of it. I slept right next to the window, with my phone on the windowsill. I used a sleep recording app on my phone because I was known to talk in my sleep, and it was amusing to hear what I'd say. In the morning, we saw that it picked up someone talking, so we all gathered around to see whatever I had mumbled during the night. This time, however, my phone recorded someone else's voice. A man's voice. Hello. At first, you can just hear a grunt, but then a man says, hello? In a loud, almost cheery tone. Then, you can just barely hear him whisper, "Oh God, something is wrong." Thank the heavens, nothing happened that night. We had no idea who the hell this man could have been. I never slept over at Sophia's house again after that, and she was absolutely terrified to sleep in her own room. She never slept with her window open again. We don't know if this guy was trying to break in, or if maybe he thought it was his buddy's house and then saw 3 teenage girls asleep and realized he was at the wrong place. I guess I'll never know, but I still get goosebumps listening to that recording. I live nowhere near Sophia's house now, but I still never sleep with my windows open.
Our next story is told by Maggie Kennedy about being in the middle of nowhere, and the only thing between you and your car is a deranged woman.
Back in January, my friend and I had just started working on our film project and were scouting for locations. We drove to a swinging bridge about an hour away from our hometown. This bridge was not sturdy at all and was meant only for walking, no running or biking or anything like that. It was about 400 feet long and 60 feet above the water. It was parallel to another, larger bridge made for vehicles. My friend and I got a few shots of the swinging bridge, then made our way across to the other side, where there was a neighborhood and some train tracks. About halfway across, we heard yelling coming from the larger bridge. We looked over and saw a woman standing on the bigger bridge, waving her arms wildly like she was trying to get our attention. She called out a name. It sounded like Hayden or Aiden. Neither of those is mine or my friend's name, so we just yelled back, "We're not them." We thought that would be the end of the conversation, but the woman just stood there staring at us. Then, all of a sudden, the woman took off, running full speed across the bridge in the same direction we were headed. We thought it was strange, but we just laughed, shrugged it off, and carried on. We made it to the other side of the bridge and began shooting footage near the train tracks. We were getting some great shots until we were interrupted by a familiar voice yelling from a distance. On top of the hill across from the tracks stood the same woman, shouting the same thing. We yelled back that we didn't know her and we weren't who she thought we were. This woman took off running once again, but this time straight towards us. This frightened us, and fight or flight kicked in. My friend and I quickly grabbed our things and headed for the swinging bridge. We knew we weren't supposed to run across, so we walked as quickly as we could, which made the bridge swing dangerously. By the time we were halfway across, the lady had made it to the start of the bridge, yelling at us in a tone that sounded hateful. I stole a glance back at her and saw that she was stopped at the entrance of the bridge, but she was holding something behind her back. Even though she'd stopped running, we didn't slow our pace until we reached the other side. Then, we turned around and saw the woman was still standing there on the opposite bank, fiddling with something in her hands. My friend pulled out her phone and began recording the woman, which made her turn immediately and walk away. We never found out why she chased us or what she was holding in her hand. I wondered if maybe she needed help, but then why not scream for help? We told her multiple times we weren't the people she thought we were, but she still followed us. I had trouble sleeping for a week after this incident. I couldn't get it out of my head. What did this woman want with us? What would she have done if she caught up to us? The lack of answers makes it so much worse. All I can say is I have never been so scared in my life.
You're listening to Disturbed. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the podcast. Our final story is narrated by Gregory James from r/Morticians, retelling all of the grisly details of a life as an undertaker.
I had just lost my job at a fast food chain and was looking for work. A family member who worked at a funeral home offered me a job there as an undertaker. Death care was something that somewhat ran in our family. The funeral company in particular was contracted by the government to do pickup jobs. Whenever the police had a situation involving a deceased individual, we would get called out to transport the corpse to a morgue. I grew up hearing all the stories of my family members' experiences in the business, so in a way, I was already aware of what this job was and what it required. Despite its macabre nature, it was, in some ways, one of the best jobs I've ever had. Each day brought a new situation, and it was important work that not everyone could handle. Unfortunately, the pay was awful, and we were compensated by the job, so my weekly income was completely dependent on whether or not people died. Eventually, I moved on from undertaking. I found a better opportunity in construction in a different state. But even now, 4 years later, I'm still ruminating on some of the really tough calls we went out on. I think for the sake of my mental health, a lot of the work is fully suppressed in my subconscious. But the ones I can remember, I remember for a reason. Here are a few of those experiences that were wild enough to pierce through the fog of my self-defense. First off, I remember a situation where an elderly woman had passed away in her walk-in closet. There was a chair centered in the middle of the closet where she would sit to rest while getting dressed in the morning. One day, she sat down and never got back up again. It was a cool month, so the maggots hadn't found her yet, but some ants did. This other time, there was a lady suffering from a terminal illness. She passed away in her room, which was thoughtfully and comfortably arranged as her final resting place. Her family knew she didn't have much time left. The strange thing about this job was that she was still very warm when I arrived. I'd gotten used to cold, stiff bodies, so her warmth reminded me that this person I was handling was alive only a few hours earlier. The majority of our jobs came from the hospital, and we had to transport the deceased patients to the city morgue. Sometimes the hospital staff transported bodies from their rooms to the hospital morgue, but other times we had to transport bodies directly from their hospital room to our van outside. In some cases, family members were still in the room. We had to politely explain to them that what they would see was very distressing, that we would have to manhandle the body. We made sure they didn't see the process of us placing the body inside of the body bag. We had a gurney that we would strap the bodies to and a red velvet covering to hide the blue body bag in a more discreet and respectful way. I distinctly remember pushing a gurney through the hospital hallway when a woman with her 2 small children crossed our path. I heard one of her children ask, "Mom, what's that?" She avoided the question and steered her kids away from us. I always got the feeling that deep down, the kids had some sort of idea that the person under the red velvet cover was not alive. Not every job was so straightforward, though. You never knew what you'd be walking into on any given day. Working as an undertaker in my home city, I knew there was always a possibility that I'd come across someone I once knew. Well, one day I arrived at the hospital morgue and signed out the body in their registry. As I read the name, my heart dropped. It was the same name as someone I had once worked with at a restaurant downtown. The body was already in the bag, so I couldn't confirm or deny if this was her. Everything was moving in slow motion as we wheeled her into our van and started driving. On the way to the city morgue, my coworker noticed I was very quiet. She asked if there was something wrong, and I explained that the body in the bag might be someone I knew. Once we arrived at the morgue, we pulled in the back garage door where a morgue technician was waiting to process the body. We placed the body bag on the cold metal table in the middle of the room. Every body needs to be photographed as they're brought into the morgue. As I unzipped the body bag, my heart was in my throat. It was, in fact, the girl I had worked with at the restaurant. I remember thinking she looked surreal. The green hue from her already decomposing skin against the flash of the camera above the table. It's a feeling I'll never forget. Another time, there was a strange job in which the loved ones of a deceased man requested we transport his body back to their home for a wake. I guess this family had a more alternative way of celebrating their loved one's life. I remember bringing the body in and placing it on a decorated table. There were candles lit all around the room. It was a very quiet, beautiful room, but just one thing really bothered me. Maybe the family didn't know what to expect, but this man's body was already decomposing. He was completely green, head to toe. It seems strange to me, but then again, everybody copes with the loss of a loved one differently. As you'd expect, we also got a lot of jobs from accidental deaths. One time, we got a call from the police that a body had been recovered from a river just off the ocean near downtown. Apparently, a man had drowned and washed up into the river. The police had already retrieved him from the water and had his body on their boat. We had to pick him up off the back of the police boat, which was strange, but I was also struck by the state of his corpse. He had dark skin, but because of the salt water, he was so bloated that his skin had ripped and fallen off in some places, revealing patches of abnormally white skin underneath. By this point, I had gotten used to the smell of a rotting corpse, but this one was exceptionally bad. The salt water made it 100 times worse, and the smell of the drowned man permeated the van for days. Even though I always breathed through my mouth, I could still taste this one on the back of my throat for a while after. There was another drowning victim that I remember pretty well, a woman in her car. We got this call in the middle of a very rainy time of the year, and this week had been storming nonstop. We were sent out to a rural property where an elderly couple had attempted to drive through the high water, blocking their driveway from the road. They got halfway across the driveway when the engine stalled out and water started creeping into the car, deep enough to submerge them in their seats. The husband managed to get out, but his wife was trapped, and there was nothing he could do but watch her perish. It was a dark and gloomy day when we pulled up, still raining while we got her out of the car and into the gurney. Hearing their story was very sobering. They were just yards away from their home, from safety, but they made a grave error. I still think about the husband sometimes. Even crossing his driveway on a daily basis has got to be traumatic. Lately, there's been a government PSA about floodwater. If it's flooded, forget it. Seeing that ad always makes me think about that job. In another drowning incident, a man had fallen off one of the beachside cliffs in our city, and his body was found washed up on the shore. The police weren't sure if it was suicide or not. It was a sunny Saturday morning, so as you can imagine, there were lots of people around. The beach had walkways and cafes all along it. We got the body and started rolling it up a ramp off the beach and back to the van. Dozens of people were staring at us, knowing full well we were transporting a body. This was just one of the many jobs in which we had an audience. Another was when we were called to a motel complex that had permanent residents. Everyone was outside watching us do our job. A man had passed away in bed and was very much decomposed. He was all black, blue, and green. I grabbed his legs, but they were slippery, and his skin would just slide and fall off as I grabbed him. Another body that was even more difficult to handle was the one we found in some government housing apartments. A man who'd been sharing heroin with an escort ended up overdosing. When we got there, he still had the needle in his arm. This job was especially challenging because we were on the top floor of a huge apartment building with no elevator. We had to carry the body down hundreds of stairs to the gurney. Then there was the sad case where the grandchildren of an older gentleman found his body in the shower with the water still running. The scalding water had left burns all over him. It must have been so hard to discover their granddad in such a state. As we placed him into the body bag, some excess gas or air passed through his esophagus, and it sounded like he took his last breath, which, ironically, took my breath away. As difficult as all these jobs were, suicide jobs were the hardest of all. I was always taught to compartmentalize jobs, which in retrospect was pretty bad advice. These suicide stories are the hardest for me to recall. One evening, we were called out to a job in a park. There were bushes and trees next to a walkway surrounding a sports field, and from one of these trees, a man was hanging by a thin rope. This was the first job where I had to assist police in taking a body down from a tree. It was in such a public place. I wondered if the man wanted to be discovered by a stranger rather than a family member. Another man hanged himself in his home and also managed to set his house on fire. I don't know how he achieved this, but there was probably some deep thought and strategy involved. His body was charred, burnt, and covered in blisters. I won't ever forget that horrible smell. Another time, we were called out to a suburban house where a man had wrapped a metal winch rope around his neck. It was attached to the back of his truck. He had hanged himself with the winch, using the winch remote control to wind it up towards the back of the truck. The remote was still in his hand upon arrival. What a slow way to go. As strange as that hanging was, it wasn't even the most surprising one I saw. An older man took his life by hanging himself off a bathroom door handle. I'd never seen anything like this. I was surprised that someone could hang themselves from such a small height. His partner was still in the house, sobbing in disbelief. These kinds of circumstances always tested my abilities, but I just had to focus on what I was doing and try not to get emotionally involved. Something I'd seen in movies and cop shows was suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning. I never thought I'd witness it in real life until I was called to a job deep in the woods. A man had parked his car and attached a garden hose from his exhaust pipe into his window. His body smelt of soot and fumes. It was an eerie sight. I never got jobs involving murder except for one. The police had to investigate whether this death was caused by manslaughter or murder. A young woman and her boyfriend had a heated argument with the boyfriend's mother. The mother eventually stepped outside to get away. The girl and her boyfriend then got in their car and chased the mother down the street until they ran her over and killed her. As an undertaker, I wasn't just responsible for body transportation. I also had to collect any body parts at the scene. My colleague and I had to pick up patches of skin off the road where the woman had been dragged under the car. Some of them still had clumps of hair on them. This wasn't the only grisly death I witnessed. Gruesome jobs always stuck in my mind. Not only were they gross, but handling the bodies was more difficult and sometimes required a strategic approach. My first day on the job was a rough one. It was an unpaid trial to see if I could handle that type of work. Let's just say if I could handle this job, any other job would be no problem. I was simply there to observe and watch my two coworkers, and I am very glad this was the case. After getting out of the van, we could already smell the stench from the curb. We were in the middle of summer in a heat wave, and this lady had been rotting in her home for an estimated 2 weeks. The stench was like no other I had smelled. It was like rotting meat and burnt rubber. The woman wasn't obese, but she had swelled and bloated so much that it seemed as if she were. She was laying at the side of her bed on the floor, surrounded by a huge pool of rot and pitch black fluid. My two coworkers started handling the body into the bag, which proved difficult because she was so decomposed that when any limbs were handled, the bones ripped out of their sockets. It made me sad to think that the woman had no one to come check on her for 2 weeks. My clothes stank after that job. The smell seeped into my shirt. I found I couldn't really stomach eating meat for a few days after that. The stories I've told today are less than 10% of what I experienced as an undertaker. Needless to say, this job was harrowing. Many of my assignments were so disturbing that I've buried them deep in my subconscious. Maybe someday I'll share more, but for now, this is all I can bear to remember.
Leave us a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify, and we just might read it on the show. And who knows, we might even have your favorite narrator read it, if you tell us who that is. Today's review comes from Avoid 3D on Apple Podcasts. I absolutely love this podcast, especially with the new stories. I'm looking forward to more. 5 stars. Thanks, Avoid 3D. We really appreciate it. Want more Disturbed? Check out our Patreon for member-exclusive content, early merch access, and other cool perks. I'm your host, Doug Bailey, and this has been Disturbed, a production of Killer Podcasts and part of the Evergreen Network. For more paranormal and true crime shows, visit killerpodcasts.com. Follow our social channels at Disturbed Podcast on Instagram or Disturbed_pod on Twitter. If you enjoyed the show, please consider subscribing and reviewing on your favorite listening platform. Share your own true horror story at disturbedpodcast.com. Music by Epidemic Sound and by Carl Casey at White Bat Audio. Our producers are Noah Fouts and Elizabeth Flood. Our audio engineer is Nathan Corson. Executive producers Bridget Coyne and Gerardo Orlando. Until next time, stay safe out there.